the Spirit of God. This is the word of the Lord.
I don't really want to remove my mask because being a superhero, if I do that, you'll know my secret identity. So maybe I should keep my mask on, but no. Here you are. I'm letting you know who I am. There you go. So we're going to look at this passage, and none of you will want to get married after this, will you? Is that right? I don't know if you've ever heard about John Stott. Now, John Stott was a guy who died about 9 years ago, and he was, in his time, one of the foremost leaders of the worldwide evangelical movement. He was one of the principal authors of what's known as the Lausanne Covenant, which was written back in 1974, and that was a very famous document about missions and things like that. So he was one of the prime leaders there. He was also the rector of All Saints Anglican Church in London all his life. Very important evangelical church in London. He made an enormous contribution to the kingdom of God. He wrote many books. He was all over the world as a teacher. He's an extremely influential man. And the other remarkable thing about John Stott was that he never married. And he lived a life of chastity. Now, John Stott asked the question, how can we call ourselves Christians and declare that chastity is impossible? And noting how Christ says, "My grace is sufficient for you," he adds, to deny the possibility of chastity is to portray the Christian as a helpless victim of the world, the flesh, and the devil, and to demean ourselves into being something that's less than human, and to contradict the gospel of God's grace. So there's no reason why, God willing, it should not be possible for a person to live a chaste life as he did. So we're going to be looking at a number of aspects now of what Paul is getting on about in these difficult verses. And first of all, we need to talk about celibacy and false spirituality. Did you know that just over 900 years ago, the Roman Catholic clergy were allowed to marry? It was only just about 900 years ago that this ruling came in that they needed to be celibate. It wasn't there from the beginning. So it's a false view of spirituality, remarkably like that which Paul is opposing in 1 Corinthians 7. It had been a false view of spirituality, been promoted for many centuries, but it found expression at the First Lateran Council in 1123 AD, when the Roman Catholic Church legislated at that time, we absolutely forbid priests, deacons, subdeacons, and monks to have concubines or to contract marriages. Now remember that Jesus had warned, hadn't he? What God has joined together, let no man separate. And so it really was in defiance of Jesus himself that the church demanded that all clergy who were married at that time should dissolve their marriages. And that the married clergy had to do that and then demonstrate repentance. Oh boy, that's a false view of spirituality, isn't it? I mean, in this letter, Paul counters the false ideas of what it means to be a spiritual person. That's the whole of the letter of the 1 Corinthians. So people had false ideas about spiritual gifts, for example, and how certain gifts made you more spiritual than other people. Or some of them had false ideas about knowledge and how that made you more spiritual. Things like that Paul's having a go at. And this is another area where Paul has a go at those who have a false view of spirituality. And so he begins this chapter 7 by quoting a slogan from the letter that the Corinthians had sent to him. And the slogan was that it's good for a man, well, it says not to touch a woman. It means not to have sexual intercourse with a woman. You know, that's what basically is the slogan. And so some thought that to be spiritual, we have to conquer our bodily passions and especially abstain from sexual intercourse. Oh, no, you can't do that. And with this perverse understanding, some chose to live a celibate life. And sadly, with such lamentable views, some Christians who were already married were withdrawing from sexual relations within marriage itself because of this false view of spirituality. Now, some Roman Catholic apologists will argue that celibacy is not the problem. But abundant evidence indicates that insisting on celibacy for the priests is asking for trouble. I mean, in Australia alone, if you put the next slide on, please, a Royal Commission investigation found that 4,444 people were sexually abused as children at more than 1,000 Catholic institutions between 1980 and 2015. And about 7% of all Catholic clergy between 1950 and 2010 were accused of sexually abusing children. And those are only the ones we know about. But add to this other widespread instances of clergy accessing pornography and engaging in sexually immoral conduct with adults. And, well, yeah, these evils have been perpetrated by non-Catholic Christian leaders as well. But mandated celibacy, to mandate it, to require it, that's foolish. Because it does not deal with the power of the God-given human sex drive. It doesn't deal with that in a responsible way. Now, Romeo told Juliet, "Darling, I am burning up with love for you." And she retorted, "Don't make a fuel of yourself." Burning up, you see, fuel. Now, as Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 7, the wise and responsible way to deal with our sex drive is by getting married. And so what does he, after quoting this slogan, what is the immediate thing that Paul says? He says in verse 2 of chapter 7, "But since there's so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband." So such is the power of our God-given sex drive that it's fully appropriate for most men and women to be married. Okay, well now we come to the issue of celibacy and true devotion. That's a bit different, this idea. Now in Matthew 19, you remember the Pharisees asked Jesus whether it's lawful to divorce for any and every reason. Now Jesus, interestingly, does not respond by going into a discussion about the law with them. What he does is he takes them back to first principles. He goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, and he quotes them from that chapter. "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." And Jesus teaches then that they're no longer two, they're one. And therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. In other words, divorce is a travesty. It does immense damage to marriage partners. It tears apart what is one flesh. In other words, it's like ripping a human body in two. That's how divorce is portrayed for us. So then Jesus tells the Pharisees that Moses only made a concession because of their hardness of heart. And he adds, "I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery." And Jesus' disciples, they then respond, you remember? You know how they responded? They said, "Well, if that's the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry." Well, marriage often does involve conflict and profound difficulties. Many people experience that. So the disciples are thinking to themselves, well, it's a bit scary to be locked into something that might bring great misery. And Jesus remarks, doesn't he, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. So the implication's clear. Relatively few people have a God-given ability to live a life of chastity. And he adds, doesn't he, Jesus, that some in God's providence are physically incapable of reproductive sexual relations. And we could even add people, quadriplegics like Joni Erickson Tada, people like that. But God has given some people the ability to live a celibate life, namely those, Jesus says, who have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. And this is pretty unusual, isn't it? So Jesus concludes, the one who can accept this should accept it, understanding it's not going to be normal. And Paul himself exemplifies this. And he states in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 7, I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift. Another has that. So the ability to live a celibate life is a gift of God. And obviously John Stott had that gift. Now Paul had been a notable Pharisee, and given what we know about the Pharisees, there is actually a strong possibility that at some time Paul had been married. But he's certainly single at the time he's writing to the Corinthian church, and we don't know any more background information on this. If he had indeed been married, we can't be absolutely certain, but if he had been married, which seems quite a strong possibility, then perhaps his wife had died, or perhaps she left him when he became a Christian, or something like that, who knows? Anyway, in verses 32 to 35, Paul again promotes the celibate life. He points out an unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. Now, Paul adds that he's not trying to restrict them. He's not trying to stop them from getting married, if that's what they must do. He only has their well-being in mind. He wants them to be free from concern. Tells them they're going to have many troubles in this world if they get married. Now, as we'll see, there may be some very particular circumstances that Paul has in mind when he gives this advice. So we've got to be careful about thinking that he's just thinking this has been across the board and it applies the same way in all situations. But still, we need to not diminish what Paul is saying. He simply wants them to be able to live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord, is what he says. Now, there have been, like Paul, some notable Christian leaders and workers who have made enormous contributions as single celibate people. Now, this is especially true of women on the mission field. When we were on the mission field, we came across quite a number of women who were single basically for the rest of their lives. And yet God was using them in extraordinary ways. This is happening all over the mission world. And most of these women, of course, are completely anonymous. Nobody knows about them. Only the Lord knows of the way in which they've been used by him in such extraordinary ways. And when it comes to men, of course, I've given you the example of John Stott. In Sydney, we had John Chapman, of course, who lived a single celibate life, one of Australia's greatest evangelists. He died a few years ago as well. But most of those who have made conspicuous contributions have been married people. But as Paul indicates, marriage does have the propensity, it can end up distracting us and preoccupying us and limiting our ability to devote ourselves to the Lord in ways which otherwise would have been possible. So you have to see that Paul's view of celibacy is nuanced, isn't it? It's nuanced. On the one hand, he's made it clear that there's nothing unclean or unspiritual about sexual relationships in marriage. That's God-given, okay, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not unspiritual. John Stott modelled a life of chastity devoted to the Lord, but he himself declared, we must never exalt singleness, as some early church fathers did, notably Tertullian, as if it were a higher and holier vocation than marriage. We must not do that, John Stott says. We must reject the ascetic tradition, which disparages sex as legalised lust and marriage as legalised fornication. We've got to have nothing to do with those ideas, John Stott says. No, he says, sex is the good gift of a good creator, and marriage is his own institution. So John Stott's saying this is a man who never got married. So we must not think that celibate Christians are more spiritual or more godly than married Christians. On the other hand, from a purely pragmatic standpoint, unmarried people have a single focus of seeking to please the Lord, or potentially anyway. They don't need to spend time and effort pleasing a spouse. So there are definite advantages in being single. That's what Paul is saying. It's pragmatic, okay? It's not spiritual, it's pragmatic. Now, I struggled greatly with this issue as a young fellow, and I was still unmarried at the age of 29 when I came across from New Zealand to Australia to study theology before heading for the mission field. And so the prospect of going to the mission field as a single man was something I found extremely difficult to face. I can tell you that celibacy is not my gift. Now, the Lord wonderfully provided Barbara to be my life partner, and we've been married at the end of this year, it'll be 40 years. Big clap, okay, right, okay. And it's been great, But we're all different, and for some of you, enjoying the advantages of a single celibate life serving the Lord may be exactly what you should do with your life. So don't assume anything. Lay your life before the Lord and seek His leading. Don't just go with the culture or with the flow. It's something where we have to devote ourselves to the Lord, isn't it? And seek His will. So when we come now to considering celibacy in a time of crisis, which is another big aspect of what Paul's saying here. Now, Paul sees positive advantages in being celibate, and he encourages Christians who are not married to remain single. But the last thing he wants to do is to give any opportunity for sexual immorality. He's made that very clear at the beginning of this chapter. So he's not trying to put people into an impossible position. He wants to avoid that. He's made that clear. And he's made it clear that he sees God-honouring celibacy as a spiritual gift. And he's also plainly taught us that we need to be realistic about our ability to control our sex drive in making our choice about whether to be single or to be married. And he also teaches that Christians who opt to be single are not more spiritual than those of us who choose to marry. And so having just encouraged those who are unmarried not to look for a wife, that's what he's encouraged them to do, he immediately adds, but if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. So, however, Paul has an added reason for encouraging the Corinthian Christians to give serious consideration to the possibility of living a single celibate life. He tells them that they're living in a time of crisis. Now, Paul believed there was a very strong possibility that the end of history was imminent. And he says, doesn't he? He says, what I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. And he adds, for this world in its present form is passing away. Now, one friend asked another what she had named her two dogs. And she replied, Rolex and Timex. And the friend asked, why would you use such peculiar names for your dogs? And she replied, well, they are watchdogs. Now, Jesus told his disciples that they needed to keep watch because history was moving towards its grand finale. Now, you remember, if you look at Mark 23, Matthew 24, Luke 21, they're all parallel passages in the Synoptic Gospels. That's where Jesus gives his Olivet Discourse, where he tells them what's going to happen in the future. Okay? Remember that great speech he gives? And he tells them that the temple and Jerusalem would be destroyed, and that associated with all this will be the rise of false messiahs and false prophets. There'd be wars, there'd be earthquakes, there'd be famines. And he told them, truly I tell you, this generation, the people he's speaking to, the disciples he's speaking to, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. This is all going to happen within this generation, Jesus says. Now, he also told them that he himself did not know the day or the hour when he would make his final return. He said only the Father knows that. But he then went on to tell his own immediate disciples that they need to think about him as being like the owner of a house who goes away and leaves his servants in charge. And he tells his own immediate disciples, you guys need to keep watch because you don't know when I'm going to come back. I don't know either. But you don't know, and I might be back too within your lifetime. Okay, you get the feeling here. The point is that they need to realize that Jesus might come back in their own lifetime. So Paul is writing this letter to the Corinthians about 54 AD. Now, the Jewish revolt began in 66 AD, just 12 years later, and the trouble was already brewing. Paul had his ear to the ground, okay? And the Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And Josephus tells us, and some people think maybe he's got the numbers a bit wrong, but he says that 600,000 Jews were crucified at that time by the Romans. Now, Paul knew that the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem had to happen within this generation, because Jesus said so. So he knew it was imminent. So he's writing with this kind of expectation there, knowing that this also would be tied to more widespread persecution. This is the same year in which the Emperor Claudius was poisoned, assassinated, and Nero took over. This is the time when Jewish persecution against Christians has been very virulent, and where the Romans now are becoming much more conscious of the fact that you cannot think of the Christians like the Jews. Now, you remember that the Romans gave the Jewish people special privileges, or they had been, and that Jews didn't have to participate in the emperor cult. But now that it was becoming clearer you couldn't confuse the Christians with the Jews, there's much more pressure coming upon the Christians to engage in the emperor cult as well. On top of that, we know that there were some major famines that took place in the 40s and the early 50s. Was Paul thinking of that as well when he gave some of this advice? I mean, if you get married in such a context, in those days, virtually no birth control like we have today. So if you get married, you're almost certainly going to have kids. And if you've got famine conditions on, there's extra mouths to feed. So there's all sorts of stuff like this going on in the background as Paul speaks. And so, Paul will say to the Corinthian Christians, you've got to live as though there's no tomorrow. because the world in its present form is passing away. And yes, that even includes marriage, as wonderful as blessing as it is. That's passing away too. You remember that Jesus corrected the Sadducees. He said, when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They'll be like the angels in heaven. And so Paul advises that since the time is short, those who have wives should live as if they had none, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it was not theirs to keep, those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them. So in other words, it's time to hold lightly everything the world gives us, ready to let go if need be. We need to make sure we don't cling to anything as though our lives depended on it. And that includes not only our possessions, it includes also your relationship, my relationship with family, with your spouse, with children even. The sense in which we have to hold lightly onto those things. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, doesn't he? I mean, the chances are that one of us is going to die before the other. Now, there is what may be another reason why some of us might decide to live a single celibate life. In verses 26 to 27, Paul emphasizes he's not trying to impose an unworkable life situation for anyone, but he does give trustworthy advice. And he says, because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for you to remain as you are. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. Now, I deliberately said that this may be another reason, because it is possible to understand this phrase, this present crisis, as some commentators have done. Some of them understand it to mean that Paul is just simply referring to the experience of living in these last days of human history, and that's all that he means by present crisis. But there are a significant number of commentators who believe, and I think they're probably right, that Paul does have in mind particular events that are taking place in history at this time. And I've already referred to some of those. And so they certainly were. Those sort of things were happening. So I think that gives an extra edge to Paul's advice. For in those times, there was no reliable system of birth control, as we've seen, and all that sort of stuff. So maybe Paul had that sort of thing in mind when he said, but those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you that. So maybe it just was a much more dangerous time at that point. Now, we're aware, aren't we, that current crises often play havoc with normal everyday life. I mean, just think of the impact that this coronavirus pandemic has had on so many lives. And we know that mental illness is on its way up, isn't it, because of this? Domestic violence rates and things like that are a real problem. Now, another impact on lives, I think there's a girl in our church, actually, who is engaged to marry someone in the US, and so they would have been married by now if it wasn't for this thing, and she's had to wait all of this year and probably all of next year, maybe, before they could get married. So the coronavirus does remind us, doesn't it, that nothing in this world is secure and lasting. And there's a sense in which really, people talk about this sort of being unusual and abnormal, but, most of history has actually had lots of things like this sort of thing happening, hasn't it? So we sort of kid ourselves when we think that more recent times have not been so abnormal. The deadliest pandemic in history occurred during the 14th century in Eurasia and North Africa. It was the so-called Black Death. Now, it was estimated that the entire population of the world at that time was around 450 million people. Okay, just get that in your mind. 450 million people in the whole world, okay, at that time. It's also estimated that the Black Death claimed the lives of somewhere between 75 to 200 million lives. And wiped out an enormous percentage of the human population. Now imagine that if you'd been living at that time, would you have considered it wise to get married? Or if you had been widowed, would you consider it wise to remarry? Now, the jury's still out on whether Paul's advice is coloured by crisis events occurring as he wrote this letter, which I think he probably was, or whether he was simply saying that the Lord's return is imminent. He's certainly saying that as well. So what's the relevance of this passage to our lives in the here and now? Well, it may be 2,000 years since Paul penned these words, but since, as Peter puts it, for God 1,000 years is but a day, we must take seriously the fact that we are living in the last days, and that our Lord will come at a time when we least expect it. It will happen in some generation. Why not ours? So we're closer to that event than ever before. And when we make major life decisions, especially about marriage, we need to do so with a keen sense that time is running out and with an earnest desire to devote our lives fully to serving the Lord. So the first thing to do before we even consider marriage, okay, the first thing we've got to do is make sure we've laid our lives on the altar, that they're the Lord's lives. That's step one, isn't it? All right, then we come to celibacy and marriage decisions then to finish off with. Now, we finish off by having to look at this rather difficult section at the end of this chapter, from verses 36 following. Now, you can see that if you look at your NIV Bible, you'll see that in actual fact, there's a footnote there with an alternative translation. So the translators had difficulty working out which is the right way to translate this passage. There's two ways you can do it. Now, they've put in the main text here that Paul is giving advice to a man who is in a relationship with a virgin, possibly engaged, although the word engaged actually is not used in the Greek, but they're just guessing that. So he's in a relationship with a virgin, possibly engaged, and he's finding it hard to control his sex drive. And so if they end up getting married, he's committed no sin. But if he's able to control himself, well, he's advised not to marry her for the reasons that we've already just discussed. However, as the NIV footnote indicates, there's another equally acceptable way of translating this text. Okay? And I think this fits the context much better personally, and is much more, from a cultural point of view, is much more likely. So, for example, if you read the American Standard Version, it reads, "But if any man thinketh that he behaveth himself unseemly toward his virgin daughter," so the point is here that it would have been very normal for the male head of the household to arrange marriage for his daughter. So the other way you can translate this closing section is that it's Paul giving advice to a father who is considering whether he should arrange a marriage for his daughter or not in these times in which they're living. And if you look at that word unseemly, it doesn't have any necessary sexual connotations. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5, Paul says that love is not rude. And that's exactly the same word. So he's obviously not talking about anything sexual there. He's just talking about stuff that's, not quite right. And so the image in verse 36, I think, is of a daughter who we are told is getting along in years, which in the culture of that day may be anything over 20 years of age. She might be getting along in years after that if she's not married by that time. And so you've got the father who's thinking to himself that maybe he's not doing the right thing by his daughter, because now she's getting a bit past it in terms of marriageable age, and he still hasn't married her off. So what's he supposed to do? And so Paul, I think, is giving advice to the father in this context that they're living in, and saying, well, look, if you decide that, he's assuming that the guy's going to be acting in a godly fashion. If you decide, in your wisdom and in a godly way that, nevertheless you're going to go ahead and marry her off, that's fine. You can do that. But if you don't, then I think that might be wiser in these present circumstances. So anyway, that's how I understand that difficult passage at the end there, and you can go away and work that out for yourself. All right? Anyway, because it's in the text, I had to deal with it. So I've just tried to deal with it as best as I can. Anyway, let's just wrap things up. Now, as we've seen, this passage does present some difficulties for interpretation. But this passage, along with the rest of 1 Corinthians 7, it plainly teaches that marriage between a man and a woman is the only context in which sexual desires should be fulfilled. So for those of you who are single, do take Romans 12 and verse 1 to heart, and remembering God's mercy, present your body as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, for this is your spiritual act of worship. And in doing this, part of our body is our sex organs, right? So presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice to the Lord means presenting our sex life to Him as well. And saying, Lord, that's yours. Knowing that He's a good and gracious God. He's a sun and shield. He bestows favour and honour. No good thing does the Lord withhold from those who walk uprightly. So the Lord's not a spoiler. So let's not think that for a moment. So the celibate single life is not more holy or spiritual, but it does have pragmatic advantages. So for those of you who are able to live such a life, it does provide a wonderful opportunity to have a single focus on living to please the Lord. And those of us who are married need to honour those who do choose to live a single life and make sure that we care for them. But time is running out. The Lord may return at any time, so let us make important decisions with this in mind, holding on to the things of this world lightly, with open hands and not with closed fists. And yes, as much as we love our spouses and our children, this includes marriage and family life as well. And some of us have experienced that. Amen. May God help you to work out what to do with all that. Now, I've got to put my superhero mask back on again, don't I now? Is that right? Okay. See you guys.